In the Gospel of Mark, here she is. Let her in. Okay. Thanks, Colin, for getting that up there on the screen. Anyway, like I was trying to say before I was so rude, somebody who is blind being given sight, being healed. And I don't know if you've ever wondered, why in the world did Mark include two stories about somebody who was blind getting to see? I mean, it is kind of a remarkable miracle. I mean, granted that, but you know, when you've only got a few things to, you know, when there's so much, why choose these two stories to put in there? Someone suggested, and I think they're completely wrong, that the reason that the second one was included is because he didn't get it right the first time. You'll remember, if you go back to chapter 8, verse 22, you'll read that Jesus healed somebody who was blind, and he had to do it twice because the first time he couldn't see clearly, and so he had to do it again. And so Mark is trying to let us know, well, Jesus really could heal them. You know, he knows how to do this. I really don't think that's the reason this second story of a blind man being healed is included. In fact, I think the reason it's included is because it speaks to what Mark is lifting up in this section of the Gospel of Mark. In fact, it's interesting because this section of Mark starts with the story being given sight. To see and to understand that really what it's about is discipleship. We've already noted, haven't we? I've spent a couple of times talking about how 3 times in this section of Mark's Gospel, Jesus predicts that he will die. He will lay down his life. And each time, as you've already heard me say, somebody points out how this is a terrible idea. At one point, Peter rebukes him and says that, you know, Messiahs don't die. Another time, the disciples began talking about who was the greatest, right? And then, of course, we have James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who ask for a place of honor when Jesus comes into his glory. It seems that the disciples don't understand what Jesus is talking about. They really don't understand what discipleship is all about. In fact, in some senses, in this section, the only guy who gets it is that rich guy who goes away sad because while he gets it, he doesn't want to embrace it, if you get my drift. He's not willing to pay the price. He's not willing to leave everything and to follow after Jesus. Of course, you'll remember at that point, Peter kind of latches onto that and says, Jesus, we've left everything to follow you. And you think, well, maybe the disciples are getting this. Maybe finally they've understood. But no, because it's just a moment later that James and John are saying, hey, can we have the positions of, you know, the right and the left in your kingdom? They think that following Jesus, I don't know where they get this, but it's about grabbing power, not laying it down. Well, all this brings us to the story that's before us this morning. Because it's interesting to me that while we don't know the identity of that rich young man, we do know the identity of this beggar. His name is Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. Now, it's kind of an interesting twist of phrase in there because Bartimaeus, bar is the Hebrew word for son. So basically what Mark is saying is the son of Timaeus, the son of Timaeus. He says it twice. And it's like, why does he do that? I think some of the reason is because of the name and what it means. Timaeus means honor. So here we have the son of honor, which I think is kind of interesting, isn't it? Especially when you consider the fact that James and John, that's kind of what they were looking for, honor. And then, of course, that rich young guy, everybody thought he had it already. And yet here twice we are told that it is this blind beggar who is the one who has honor. For most of this section in Mark, Jesus has been emphasizing what it means to be his disciple. And all of the players, the disciples, the rich guy, all of them just don't get it. And yet it seems that this blind beggar does. So we come to this pivotal moment in the gospel, and we find Mark lifting up this vision of what a true discipleship is by helping us and longing for us to look at Bartimaeus. I guess that begs the question, well, what is a true disciple? What is Jesus wanting us to see in these words? This story happens in a very familiar place, doesn't it? It's where Joshua had begun his conquest of the promised land. It's where Joshua fought that famed Battle of Jericho. Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. Nobody's going to join me? Do you know the song? Have you heard it? Okay, maybe I was going, no, it's probably just an American thing, and they're looking at me like, what in the world is he doing? And here, but here's this thing that's happened there. It's also the place where that tax collector named Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a very little man. You know that one too, right? Yeah. Probably ought to quit there. But Mark doesn't share that story. Rather, he centers on this story, the story of Bartimaeus. Not of a story when Jesus is entering Jericho, but on his way to Jerusalem. Now, that road would have been a busy road. It's kind of like the Manchester Road. There were people coming and going to Jerusalem, going to the temple. Coming from Jerusalem, coming from the temple. I mean, to be honest, it's the perfect place for a beggar to set up shop. For people. There was no safety net in Jewish society. And so beggars were dependent on the generosity of others to survive. People like you and me, to give them just a pittance, a coin, a something. And so what a better place to come and beg on this road that led to the temple. I mean, let's face it, if you're going to the temple, your mind is probably on heavenly things, on good things, right? And you think, well, maybe I should just go ahead and give this guy some money as well, I always imagine Bartimaeus sitting on this tree-lined road. He'd found some welcome shade under those sycamore trees. And he'd laid out his cloak to catch the coins that were tossed his way. And he would beg, crying out for mercy for those who are coming and going. Now, I would venture to guess that when he arrived that morning, he wasn't thinking, today I'm going to get to see. I think he was just hoping that he'd get a few coins, that he might be able to buy some bread. I was reminded of the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray. The central petition of that prayer, give us this day our daily bread. My guess is this guy prayed that every morning as he made his way to that spot, because without bread, he would die. And as Bartimaeus was there that day, there was this, wasn't there? There was this unrest, this noise, a dialogue going on, and somebody say that it's Jesus. Yeah. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. He's like an unconsolable child. He just keeps yelling and yelling, and nobody can shut him up. They try, but he just yells all the louder. There's a sense in which he has nothing to lose. No one can distract him from his cry. No one can stop him reaching out to Jesus. Now, there's a couple of things that I want us to ponder here. First, did you notice that nobody was listening to what Bartimaeus was saying? Not a one. They just wanted him to shut up. They just wanted him to be quiet. Maybe you're thinking, well, how do you know they weren't listening? Well, if they'd been listening, if they'd been listening, they would have heard what Bartimaeus was yelling, because it was profound. It was insightful. If they'd fully taken on board what Bartimaeus was saying, it would have changed. It would have changed their lives. It would have fulfilled who are waiting for the Messiah. But they weren't listening. Were you? First he yells Jesus, doesn't he? The name, Jesus. They're on the outskirts of Jericho, where a guy named Joshua. Do you know that Joshua and Jesus are the same name in Hebrew and in Greek? Do you know what they mean? God saves. God brings salvation. And then he yells, Son of David. Now, this is more than just a simple title. It's more than just simply a recognition that maybe there was somewhere in Jesus's distant past some connection to the royal family. No, this was a messianic title. This was the title of the one that they were waiting for. This was the anointed one, the one who had been promised. This was the one in which all of Jerusalem, all of the people of the Jews were looking to in hope, who would come. The one who was promised. And it's interesting because in Mark's gospel, this blind beggar is the only one who utters those words, who shares that insight. The only one who sees Jesus for who he truly is. In fact, in the next section of this story, do you know what we have? If you turn the page in your Bibles, the next story is the Triumphal Entry. And in Matthew's rendering of that story, do you know what the crowds yell? Hosanna to the Son of David. I kind of wondered, maybe Bartimaeus was in that crowd. Because we do know that he followed him, right? Maybe he was leading that chant in the crowd. Hosanna, Son of David. You know what Hosanna means, don't you? Save now. But again, nobody is listening. In fact, as I shared before, they're trying to silence him. And I find myself wondering how often people come to Jesus and are silenced. You think, well, I'm sure it's not that often that happens. But you know what? It happens in chapter 10 of Mark's gospel. Little children are brought to Jesus, and what do the disciples do? No. Jesus doesn't have time for these guys. And it's not just there. Countless times through the scriptures and through history, we have sought to marginalize the marginalized, to take those who are without influence and to disregard them even further, to push them aside, to rebuke them. And it got me thinking about how often we ignore or we don't hear the cries of those that are around us. We're like a parent consumed with our agenda who doesn't hear the cries of their own child. We don't hear the cries of those who are crying out for help around us because we're so consumed with our own stuff, our own plans, our own dreams. And I think about how discipleship is about being like Jesus. And I wonder, do we hear the cries of the people who are around us? Or do we stick on our earbuds so we don't have to listen to the noise, to the cries? Now, thankfully, in this story, Jesus hears his cry, doesn't he? He hears the cry of Bartimaeus. I don't want you to miss what I just said. Jesus hears the cries of a blind beggar. a nobody, an outsider, one who has nothing to offer him, nothing to give. And he hears his cry for mercy. I don't know about you, but that kind of gives me hope. For myself, for us, that God would hear our cries. And we're told that he stops and he beckons this man to come to him. And this is where we see another attribute of discipleship. It's found in the actions of Bartimaeus. I mean, if you think Bartimaeus has been crazy to this point, yelling, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me," relentlessly, he is now a man possessed. Because in the text we read that he jumps up and throws aside his cloak and he comes to Jesus. I kind of imagine him running. Now, I'm not sure how he would do that being blind, but there is this sense, don't you think, as you hear those words, of this reckless abandon in how he comes to Jesus. And there's something that is very easy for us to miss in these words. It's something that we can kind of dismiss. It's a passing comment. Mark says that he threw his cloak aside. Now, I need you to understand something about Mark. Mark had an economy of words. He didn't just add fluff to his stories. Most of the time, he took it out. He's not trying to paint a picture here. He is saying something profound. He's wanting us to understand something profound. Now, I'm not a blind man, and I've never been without my sight, but I'd imagine that if you're blind, the last thing that you do anything, right? Places where you can remember so that you can find them again. I mean, to throw something is to never find it again. It's to give it away. I remember when I was attending Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego, and I had a friend named Breck who was blind. We would play cards together. Now, if you're wondering how in the world we did that, we had Braille cards. We had brilliant times of fun. I remember this one time, this has nothing to do with the message, but I just want to share this story. I remember this one time, the power went out in our dorm. This is a huge storm by California standards. And there was rain, which is unusual, and there was wind, and the lights went out. And I had my laundry down on the first floor of the dorm. And so Breck said, "Do you want me to help you get there?" And so there we are. I'm holding onto his hand, onto his elbow, like he would hold onto mine. And he's leading me to where the laundry was. And he did it perfectly. We always joked about it later, the blind leading the blind, except he could really see. He knew exactly where he was. Anyway, we would play cards together all the time. And, when you're playing your card, you just kind of toss it. He would never toss it. He would always place it carefully. And yet here in our story, Bartimaeus, he throws his cloak. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, it's just a cloak, Steve. It's not a big deal. I mean, it's not much. But it was way more than a cloak. This was his warm blanket on a cold night. This was his protection from the elements. It was his shelter. In many ways, it was his ability to collect money. It was his bank. It was everything to this man. I mean, if you want to know how precious it is, take away your teen's mobile phone. Or when you get home this afternoon, turn off the broadband and see what happens. It could get real nasty for a little bit, right? I mean, that's how precious this cloak was. Or you can, I was going to say you could take your child's special teddy or little blanket, but that's kind of cruel, I think. I mean, you get my picture, right? The picture I'm trying to paint, right? This was not rubbish. This was important to him. And yet he treats it like rubbish. It reminds me of our rich friend earlier in chapter 10. Remember him? The guy who couldn't let go? Jesus had said to him, "Go, sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and then come follow me." And he couldn't do it. He refused to throw it. Because his security was found where? In his wealth. His identity was found in his wealth. And yet where he failed, Bartimaeus flourishes. I mean, he jumps to his feet. He throws aside his cloak. He comes to Jesus. Following Jesus is about laying down our cloaks. It's about giving everything we have away, everything that we trust him, to trust in him alone. Our security is to be found in nothing but him. That's what a disciple is. There was something else I found that was kind of interesting, because, there's another place that a cloak is mentioned in this gospel. It's the next chapter. In fact, the next verses, where the people, as Jesus is entering the city, are laying their cloaks, remember, on the ground as Jesus enters. I wonder, are we willing to lay down our security, our cloaks, at the feet of Jesus, to trust only in him? Now, in this story, this cloak is quickly forgotten. It's never mentioned again, truth to be told. Because the focus now turns to Jesus, doesn't it, in this story? Because Jesus asked this question of this man, this blind beggar. And the question is kind of like, wait, have I heard that before? There's this deja vu moment. Because the question that Jesus asks the beggar is exactly the same question that Jesus had asked the disciples. What do you want me to do for you? I wonder, as he uttered that question again, I wonder if the disciples kind of like, oh yeah, I remember that. That didn't go too well. When they'd asked to sit at his right and his left. And then I find myself wondering, why in the world would you even think about asking a blind man that kind of a question? It seems kind of obvious to me. I mean, what do you want me to do for you? Well, duh, come on. And yet in asking to see, this blind man was actually acknowledging that he could see who Jesus really was. He doesn't ask for a few coins. He doesn't ask for a slice of bread. He asks to see. He asks for something that really only the Messiah, only the Son of David, only Jesus could do. He asks to see. And Jesus acknowledges that in his response, because he says to Bartimaeus, he says, "Go, your faith has made you well." And that is where we see a disciple in the final place, in this final attribute, in these actions, the actions of Bartimaeus that follow. I mean, you saw what he did, right? His sight is restored, but instead of running back into Jericho to where had been his home, we find him following Jesus on the way. Instead of taking what he might have from this benevolent giver of gifts and going home, he follows Jesus on the way of the cross. And all that becomes abundantly clear as we turn the page in this gospel, because Jesus is about to enter Jerusalem, and he's not going there on a holiday. He is going there to die. He's going there to be handed over by the chief priests to those who would beat him, condemn him to death, spit upon him, flog him, and then eventually kill him. And yet, without hesitation, Bartimaeus follows Jesus along the way. It's really easy to read this story and to think that the change that was brought in the life of Bartimaeus from his encounter with Jesus was that his sight was restored. I don't think that's the main change. Because in reality, the real change that was brought to bear in this man's life is that his life moved in a completely different direction. He was now following Jesus. And it got me thinking, it is not enough to have met Jesus. It is not enough to even have received his mercy and his grace. True discipleship is found in following him. It embodies really what Jesus had said early in this section of Mark's gospel, where he said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. It's interesting. In the Gospel of Mark, the identity of Jesus is often hidden. Jesus is constantly telling demons to be quiet in Mark. He performs miracles before crowds gather, again seemingly to keep his identity under wraps. In Mark 5, Jesus raises a little girl from the dead and then immediately tells his parents, don't tell anyone. And then in Mark chapter 8, when Peter declares, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, what does Jesus say? Shh, don't tell anyone. And the crazy thing is, as you think about all of that in Mark chapter 10, verse 48 or whatever it is, Bartimaeus yells at the top of his lungs, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on him, declaring who he is. And what does Jesus do? He doesn't shut him up. He declares it with him. He has mercy on him. And I wonder, might we, like Bartimaeus, see Jesus for who he really is? If, like Bartimaeus, that we would throw aside our cloaks, our security. If, like Bartimaeus, that we would receive his mercy. And if, like Bartimaeus, that we would follow after him who is our shepherd, our Lord, our King. Let me tell you that following after him is the greatest adventure there is. It's a life of wonder, because the Lord is our shepherd. We lack nothing. He makes us to lie down in green pastures. He leads us beside quiet waters. He refreshes our souls. He guides us along the right path for his name's sake. And even when we walk through the darkest valley, we need fear no evil, for he is with us. His rod and his staff, they comfort us. He prepares a table before us in the presence of our enemies. He anoints our heads with oil. Really, our cup overflows. And his goodness and love follow us all the days of our lives, so that we might dwell in his house forever. Oh, that we might be like Bartimaeus. That we might follow after him. We're going to sing a song in closing. It's a song based on Psalm 23. It speaks of God's leading in our lives. But there's something that's interesting. That's not a question, that's a statement. The question is, do I follow? Do you follow? Like Bartimaeus, are you willing to throw it aside? Just get rid of it. To get rid of what you find your security in and to follow after him. Let's sing these words together and make them a prayer for this morning.